Hello humans and other species, I'm Batsy, and welcome to Skull Island, a collaborative series where I build your suggestions and ideas, with the goal of working together to achieve the coolest base ever. In previous episodes, we made a functional fishing boat, capable of sailing around the island. And of course, it's also a fishing farm. We also made this fantastic quarry that uses mechanical bearings for decorative contraptions, with a cobble generator at the core of it. Another connection for future mining projects, and an elevator to take us deep into the mines. For today's episode, and as suggested by you all, we will be making a radio station. I'm going to be real here. This is the suggestion that I'm more scared about, because I have zero idea of what you all had in mind when suggesting this. I have been thinking about it during the weekend in preparation for this video, and I think I came up with a cool idea that could fit the theme of the radio station. I was looking around the internet for pixel art, and I found these two pictures from a game called Pixel People. At least I think it's a game, but anyway. I like the idea of having those big circular antennas, which I believe they are satellite antennas and mostly used for TV stuff. So nothing to do with radios. In fact, radio stations generally have these triangular antennas with smaller stuff attached to them. But those seem a bit more boring to look at, and I think I want to add more moving elements in my builds. We have the Create mod in the server after all. That's why I think these big circular ones seem a bit cooler and funnier. My hope is that we can add some redstone to it and make it somewhat functional. Functional in the sense that it spins and moves around. Anyway, that was the longest intro ever. That's going to be the plan for today. Now, where should we start? Choosing the location for our new building is likely a good start. The beach is probably a no-go. That would look ridiculous. I think I would rather leave this section for something else, maybe a future castle or something. We are still living on a boat with a soggy bed. Maybe it could go up here. I think the middle part should be reserved for the tree farm, but there's a good section here that has a straight cliff that could be ideal for the radio station. And I assume it's better to have an antenna on top of a cliff, rather than down on a valley or something. Alrighty, we have a location for it. And I like it there. I think it's going to look fantastic. I was thinking that having it overhanging from the cliff could look interesting, but that's also the idea I had for the tree farm, so not sure I want to do the same with all buildings. If we build a massive tree trunk in this location, which is the original idea for the tree farm, we could have some of the roots go down this way. That would leave about a chunk of space between the trunk and the radio station. I guess if we were to place something between them that doesn't overhang. Maybe attaching a sawmill or something like that, or an open warehouse for the tree farm. Like those that look like a parking lot, but with a cover on top. That should probably give enough variation so not everything overhangs, right? I like this idea. I think it's going to look good. Alrighty, I will go farm some materials, and I will bring you all back when I start building something.
Many hours later.
Well, I think I completely lost my sanity. I thought I would come to the creative world to test a couple of things. Mostly so I know what blocks are we going to be using. But instead of deciding on the color palette, I just spent more than 4 hours of my life doing this thing. I would have never expected how hard it is to do circular shapes in an angle. I have never been this exhausted after building something. But I mean, it looks pretty good, right? My original idea was to use these small copycat bytes to make the antenna on a much smaller scale, pretending they are just normal blocks, but smaller. So I thought, okay, I will try a quick shape, see how that looks, and just go and do it on the server instead. But after half an hour, it just became apparent how hard this actually is that I thought, I'm just going to finish it here and import it with a cannon. But regardless, I think the antenna is looking as good as it's ever gonna be. I went and used gray concrete for the antenna itself. I think it looks half okay. But I'm wondering if I should make it fully white instead. Mainly so it contrasts with the building, which is primarily made with stone. And also, from the research I have done, they all seem to be brighter and mostly white. Another detail I added are these sort of beams that meet at the center of the antenna. From my research, it seems like at the center of it there is a thing called the feed, which I guess it's like what actually generates the signal in the first place. I imagine that signal bounces on the big surface of the antenna, and that's how it reaches far away. The interesting thing is that these beams don't seem to do anything at all, other than to keep the feed in place. Which I guess I lied. that actually doesn't sound any interesting. But speaking of the beams, I'm kinda sad that I couldn't make the diagonal ones be 1 block thick only, because it needs to be glued in order to spin around. If they are only 1 block, the glue doesn't recognize them as connected. So that's a bummer. But overall, I think it looks pretty alright, especially when staring at it from far away. It really gives that antenna feeling. The last thing to mention before we import this on the server are the proportions. I think it makes no sense to have such a massive antenna on such a tiny building, but at the same time, I find it hilarious. The style of this base is to be more cartoony, to resemble a video game. I think that the current proportions are ideal to achieve that look. Alrighty, that was a lot of progress. Let's make a schematic out of this, move it to the server, and start building some stuff already. The first thing I want to take care of is to make sure I get the proportions right. I think I'm pretty happy with how it was looking in the creative world, so it's a matter of trying to remember the exact numbers I used. At the end, I went for 7 blocks tall at the side of the cliff and 5 blocks tall overall, with the rest being 7 blocks wide and 9 blocks long. Generally speaking, using odd numbers tend to help making proportions. I'm sure there is an entire science behind it to explain it, but all I know is that it's generally easier to fit doors, windows, and so on in the buildings, and that things generally look well proportionate with odd numbers. Next comes the texturing, and for this part, I want to try a new technique that I've been learning from watching the master himself B-dubs. Texturing with darker tones is obviously nothing new, but the way of doing it and the reason behind it is quite new to me. The idea is to look at the build and notice where the natural shadows and highlights of the builds are. You want to try to add the darker parts of your texturing where those shadows are. The idea is to follow the natural look of the build, especially in case you have a more complex wall. You don't want a dark block on a pillar at the front where the sun is hitting all day. You want it at the back where the shadow of said pillar is. Something else that I'm trying is that instead of spreading the textures more randomly, I'm trying to make the pattern downwards. Generally, weathering and degradation tend to happen vertically because of gravity, unless there are other reasons, like plant spreading and whatnot. I end up changing the specific blocks several times, but that's more or less what I'm trying. Filling up the shadows with vertical stain patterns. On the highlights, I'm mostly adding a few blocks to make it blend a bit more with the terrain around it. There is so much moss that I imagine some would spread onto the wall or something. I'm not too concerned with this corner because here is where I want to add most of our decorations, so we only need a simple texture for the background. That's another great teaching of the Master B-dubs. Don't overdo the texturing and add complicated decorations on top, it will look too busy, especially with blocks that have too much texture in them. You want balance. I will leave on screen the reference picture I was using as inspiration for this design. I liked the idea of a building with close to no openings on it. Just having a couple of windows quite high up on the wall that will barely let the sun go through. From seeing radio stations and movies and the research I have done, they always seem to be flat walls with close to no windows. And even if there are some windows in the building, it's never in the areas where all of the equipment is. Like the rooms with the mics or the side room with all of the fancy soundboards and all of that. Those always seem to have no windows. I'm not sure if that's just because it's more of an office building and it's cheaper to build that way, or if there is a technical reason why that's the case, but I like that idea, so that's what I'm going for. Decorating is what usually takes the longest time to do, by far. My idea for this build is to add details that look like electrical components. I love using shafts as the electric wires, or more specifically, as the pipes that contain the wires for protection and security purposes. I'm also using a display as one of those big boxes with all of the fuses and electrical circuits in them. And surprisingly, the detail I struggled the most has been to blend the bottom of the building with the cliff. I was struggling to come up with a way to transition them, or at least in a way that I liked. I also think shafts work great as normal pipes. The difference comes down to what we add around them. And I think that's an important detail. in order to give that electrical feeling. My idea here is to add random blocks and components that give the feeling that they could be electrical. That way, our mind fills the gap assuming that all of those shafts, interconnecting all of those electrical blocks, must be wires or something like that. I think the texturing we made around the windows look fantastic, so my focus now is to fill up the rest of the bottom section. And more specifically, I'm trying to figure out how to show that this is a radio station and not a generic research center. At the end, a good old sign is going to make the difference. I think that a proper build needs to be able to transmit the feeling of what is supposed to be, to a certain degree. I'm someone that believes that having to explain what something is meant to be just shows that I failed at building it. Of course, there is more to it, but in general, I think a build in itself should be able to transmit most of it. For the facade, I think that it needs to be a boring gray wall. We added so much around the build, I don't think we should be adding any more details. Some parts need to be boring in order to highlight the rest of the more interesting bits. Because the facade is more plain and boring, it's more likely that we are going to notice the machinery on the roof. And here we have it in all its glory. What a beauty! So a couple of things. The sign. I was inspired by those big buildings that sometimes have the name of the business in the facade or near it. Like a Microsoft warehouse having the Microsoft name and logo on the side or something. I thought since it's looking a bit futuristic, it kind of fits to do it with Nixie tubes instead of an actual billboard or something. I also ended up making the antenna with mushroom stems. I tried with several white blocks, but everything was a bit too bright. This one turned out to be a bit better, I think. It has some texture, but it's mostly just white. And I think that's pretty much it. I covered everything else in the time-lapse. I guess the facade, I could mention it again. I really love how it looks. I guess because it's quite a small building, we can get away with having it be completely flat. It really gives the vibe of a boring and functional building. I think we could even remove those plows so it's properly fully flat, and it would still look great. Unlike the interior, which isn't looking so great. But fear not, I have seen this trick on a video the other day. If you open and close the door really fast, an amazing interior will appear. Or maybe not. This is still the same. Maybe it's the door that is broken. Or maybe I was tricked by some editing magic. These silly YouTubers always tricking me. Actually, editor 𝐋𝐢𝐧𝐤𝐬, can't you do some of that editing magic too, so we can get an amazing interior in here? Wow! Look at this insane floor. Editor 𝐋𝐢𝐧𝐤𝐬 must have spent hours texturing this. I'm joking. There is an entire interior to look at too, and it's looking so phenomenal. It's a bit more cramped than I was expecting, but to be honest, I have no idea why I thought this was going to be any spacious. I did added a bit of redstone, so the antenna doesn't remain static all the time. There's a water wheel down there that gives some rotation. This bearing is consuming such small amount of stress that it doesn't really matter what we have connected to it. Attached to the water wheel, I added a clutch and a gear shift, in case we want to make it stop or change the orientation manually. It's a small detail, but I actually like it a lot how it goes up and down. I think it gives a pretty cool look of some sort of machines attached to the wall. After that, things get a bit more automated. I'm using a speed controller to reduce the speed down to 1 RPM, and some cogwheels to reduce it further to 0.25 RPM. It's an antenna after all, it's not meant to be spinning fast like a disco ball. Right now it's turning slow, but it has enough speed so it doesn't feel so static. I'm achieving that with a simple clock made with 2 extenders. For 1 minute it will be powered up, and for 1 minute it will be offline. That's how we are controlling the gear shift automatically. I also added this valve in case we need to manually adjust the orientation. This is here mostly because it bypasses the slow circuit, so we want die of old before it turns around. I wanted to add some stuff to simulate one of those fancy audio keyboards. I really don't know how they are called. I had a couple of ideas on how to do them with pulse extenders and repeaters. Sadly, you can imagine with such tiny space, that idea never happened. But I did added this recording room thing, because of course, this is a radio station. It needs one of these. From what I've seen, they seem to mostly have glass walls and a glass door. And I think it kind of gives the vibe of what is meant to be. Inside, I added a couple of chairs with a table. I imagine this is where we are going to record our podcasts or something like that. We also have a microphone hanging from the ceiling, which I actually think it looks quite convincing, to be honest. And some of those panels they always have in the walls to avoid the echo and all of that. I just added some copycat boards with gray wool, and it really does the trick. I mean, you need to use some imagination, but it kind of shows what this is meant to be. I'm honestly super happy with this interior and with this building in general. I normally do farms and stuff like that. I never done a random building with no particular purpose, but I'm glad the humans suggested it for the island. It's such a cool addition. Now, if you would excuse me, I have an epic radio show to make. Hello, humans and other species. I'm Batsy, and I'm coming to you live from the Skull Island. Today, we are going to be talking with a coral expert, but first, let's listen to an amazing song called Heroes and Dreamers.
Feel the pride, let's show our colors.